Welcome to this Knowledge Transfer Network Geospatial Pavilion session about geospatial and climate education. We hope this helps steer the next generation towards the subjects that we are so passionate about ourselves. My name is Alistair Graham, and I will be moderating this session. I'm currently the UK lead at Sparkgeo, a geospatial services company with strong links to climate and environmental monitoring work. We hire developers and data scientists to interact with huge geographic data sets and provide meaningful information from those data. My background is in Earth observation, specifically satellite imagery, with a focus on open source and open data. It was actually a desire to be a polar climatologist that first brought me to Earth observation. I've not made it to the poles, and I think it would be a bit difficult to justify going there these days. But I do still find geospatial data fascinating, especially for environmental monitoring. As we are painfully aware from many examples in the media, the impacts of climate change and location are inherently linked. This panel session has brought together specialists in geography and climate education, as well as those who've been trained in Earth observation and climate science, and those who currently help train the next generation of scientists. The plan for this session is to try and better understand what is being done to promote the learning pathway for today's students and encourage young people to continue in geographical education for the purposes of strengthening the science behind climate action. With that in mind, let's meet our panelists, Ruth, Lisa, Keiko, and Paul. Ruth, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Oh, the pressure of going first. Thanks, Alistair. So my name is Ruth Amy. I'm an earth scientist by training, so I did earth sciences at the University of Oxford, and I kind of stumbled into this because of school. I quite liked science and I quite liked maths, but I didn't feel like doing any of those at university, but I've always liked being outside and geography, and so that kind of steered me towards earth sciences, and then from this I decided to do a PhD at the University of Leeds using satellites to look at earthquakes. So like many people in this room, I'm satellites and all the data that they give us and the things that we can look at really interest me. So I stayed to do a research position at the University of Leeds, and now I manage SENSE, which is an Earth observation PhD program. So I can talk a bit more about what a PhD is later, but all of our students are working on using satellite data to solve environmental issues, many of them working on climate change. And I also manage Space Hub Yorkshire, which is a new cluster of space expertise that we're developing in the Yorkshire region. So that's me. Nice to meet you.
Cool. Paul, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Paul. I have been a geography teacher for the last sort of 10, 15 years now. And over the last few years, I've got increasingly involved in climate and nature emergency education through creating some free teaching resources, so a whole series of lessons based around climate breakdown. And I've done a lot of work training teachers and also just encouraging teachers to engage with climate change in a slightly more contemporary sense and moving beyond what kind of school teachers might think around the sort of science of it, and instead looking more in terms of the human impacts and the broader societal questions. And then also more recently, I've helped set up a group called Radical School Geography, which is encouraging school teachers to be a bit more radical in their approach and actually bring lots of ideas that are being taught at university and engaging school children with those. And a lot of this is around that lens of the Anthropocene and thinking about the world that we live in now and the need to educate children in a slightly different sense. So hopefully there'll be a chance to kind of explore that a bit more as well.
Yeah, definitely. No, that sounds really interesting. Lisa, do you want to go next?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Eliza Goldberg. I am a second-year undergraduate at Stanford University out in Mountain View, California. And I really got into this field through NASA in the Earth Sciences Division. I started working for NASA at age 14, so about 6 years ago. And throughout my time at NASA, I've had the opportunity to use a lot of different kinds of satellite data to monitor mostly global mangrove and wetlands change and vulnerability. And I work with stakeholders and policymakers to be able to actually apply that data towards sustainable decision making around the world. Aside from my work with NASA, I'm really excited to have been working with Google and the Google Earth Engine team for the last several years towards developing a program called Cloud to Classroom, where we're looking to take Google tools and satellite imagery in general and give them in the hands of K through 12 students around the world, as well as university and graduate students, to help them better use satellite imagery to understand things like deforestation and other climate indicators around the world more tangibly. So really excited to be here and to speak with you all.
Brilliant, thank you. And Keiko.
Hi everyone, my name is Keiko Nomura. So I've actually did talk to Alistair before, and I actually met Eliza in person a few years ago at Geo for Good event. So it's nice to talk to you again, and nice to meet you, Ruth and Paul. It's really great to learn about your background. I'm looking forward to talking to you. In terms of my background, I'm currently the Director of Product Development in a company called Climate Engine. We provide a climate-related data set and using machine learning and satellite images to companies and organizations. Previously, I was a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. And the path that got me there was actually before that, I was working for the United Nations Environment Program in Southeast Asia, where I was working on a forest conservation program, and I was very frustrated with data. Sometimes it was a lack of data, but often it was more sort of why we cannot have much more convincing narrative based on these data. And I thought we need to do it better. So I wanted to learn more about remote sensing, and that got me to Edinburgh. And today now I work as a remote sensing scientist, mostly in the area of vegetation, but also wildfire and droughts.
Wow, I feel like I should have studied harder. So all of you got amazing backgrounds. So thank you very much for coming on the panel today. So as you can hear, this panel has a wealth of experience, and I hope that we can tap into some of that today. The session, as I said, is aimed primarily at students of any age who want to find out more about geography, geospatial, which we're taking to mean the tools of the geographer's trade for handling spatial data, and career paths around climate change. So how are we educating and inspiring today's students in climate science and geography with the goal of future climate action? Maybe my first question can go to Paul, as you deal with schools quite a lot. So why do you think that geography is important for the next generation of activists and students and practitioners in the area of climate change? Some people would argue maybe it should be computer science or maybe it should be physics, but I want to sort of focus on geography.
Yeah, I think as a group of geographers, we all know what it is that's very particular and special about geography in the sense of how we look at the world. You know, there's the story that I think every teacher, but everyone talks about this idea that, you know, if you had someone who was a product designer, they would look at something in a different way to how a geographer would. And what we're realizing increasingly is actually that the skills of a geographer are important for I was going to say solving, but I think that's the wrong phrase, but exploring and understanding lots of the challenges that we face around the world. What I would say, though, is it's really interesting at the school level that that's still not necessarily understood. And a lot of young people who are really invigorated around the idea of activism and want to challenge some of these ideas, actually don't necessarily see it at the school level within geography. And I think that's something, working with academia and with people like yourselves in organizations who are really at the forefront of using data sets in order to explore these sorts of things. I think allowing young people to understand that is really important to show actually the role that geography plays within these situations. And I think it's a challenge because often we'll see in the media the job description of the person who's being interviewed is not necessarily a geographer. That often the way that geography works is people then go into specialisms and they have a job title that becomes very niche. And even though what they're talking about might be geography, and in order to get there, they have studied geography, young people might not appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I've seen that in my own sort of cohort of people who came through geography with me, and in that very few of them would now, if I was to find them, would say that they were geographers, but they were all using the skills that they had through that. I was just wondering, Liza, whether or not geography was something at a sort of school and university level that's really pushing you into the climate activism, or whether that came from a general interest in the climate first.
Yeah, sure. So believe it or not, geography is actually not taught largely in American schools.
Wow.
The last time I think I took a formal class called geography was probably back in the 7th grade. And so I think, in high school, it's much more of a focus on sort of the more general science subjects. So things like biology, things like chemistry, things like environmental science. Ultimately, it was none of those that got me interested in the field of climate science in the first place. I started to really be interested in the field actually back when I was quite young, back in elementary school. I got the opportunity to take this seminar that let us actually go out and interact with the Chesapeake Bay, which is a local watershed area just north of DC, where I'm from. And through that class, I was finally able to, that was the first time I heard the words climate change. That was the first time I understood that really humans had an impact on the world around us. They weren't just two kind of separate entities. Nature and humans are not, different worlds here. So I really fell in love with the field of environmental science. And though I certainly was not able to pursue it through a spatial sense, through geography, through my education, I think that's something that I'm definitely personally pushing towards in my work. I think so much of the worlds of biology and of environmental science can be enhanced within the American school systems if you take in data, if you put in a spatial understanding that really helps kids contextualize these sorts of general global trends that we're learning about in, biology class, for example. If we put a map on it, then suddenly they can understand, this is how these trends are going to impact me personally. And I think that's kind of the core of the issue here. So yeah, definitely excited to hear your perspectives in terms of, how geography has been taught abroad and, ideas for potentially starting to incorporate it a little bit more into American schools, regardless of whether it's a formal subject or not.
Yeah, no, definitely. Keiko, maybe we can jump to you then. Is geography something that you fondly remember being taught, or?
It's pretty much similar to Liza, what Liza said about school. I'm originally from Japan, and I received my education up to higher education in Japan. And it's not a really one huge field. We continuously learn. So I don't even remember exactly what we learned in geography class back in high school. It was really, in my case, later in life, when I was literally standing next to a huge tree in Indonesia. It's just, like you look up and you can't even see the top of the tree. But using remote sensing and aerial images, you can actually get the height of those trees, and you can see beyond where you are standing, how much trees are there, where we are losing, and why. These things really got me into geography and remote sensing. And so I had to learn after I got interested and looking at Geography 101. And I started but really late in life, really from PhD program.
Cool. And Ruth, I was going to ask you, because you, through Sense, you deal primarily with people coming out of undergraduate degrees and moving on to postgraduate degrees. Do you find that there's a lot of geographers that come through that, or is it a mix, or how does that work?
Well, it actually is a real mix. So yeah, we're a PhD program. So after you've done your undergraduate degree, a PhD is where you work with an academic at a university for maybe 3.5 more years in the UK, different in other places I know. And yeah, this is funded, and this is a chance to be a scientist and to do science and get your hand on satellite data and find out what it means. And so all of the students on our PhD program, they all use satellite data and they all solve environmental problems. And we get people from, there's certainly a lot of geographers, so maybe people who, first learned about glaciers and geography and fell in love with this, and now they want to use satellites to look at it. But we also get a lot of people from maths and physics and earth sciences and natural sciences. So you kind of get a bank of people who are really interested about the earth and want to know why it's like this and find out, use satellite images to see more and find out more. And then we kind of get a bank of people who've got these great technical skills and think, you know, I've got these coding skills, but what can I do that's really interesting, useful, and have come at it from that angle. So we get a good mix of people with mix of skills who's kind of, some people, you know, always knew that they wanted to study the earth, and others have kind of, you know, gone down a more technical route and have come back to it. So it's a really interesting range.
No, that's really cool. So I feel that I was really lucky. So when I was in secondary school, comprehensive school, we managed to get a grant, I guess, to have a satellite dish on the school. And you used to get images come down like one line at a time. It took half an hour for a single image to be downloaded from the satellite as it went over. But it was fascinating because that got me thinking about all the work that we'd been doing in terms of air masses and climate and sort of the climatic cells and things, the meteorological cells. And so that got me into thinking about climate change and everything else. So one of the things I think I'm hearing here is that there's, particularly in America and Japan, it seems, there's a bit of a disconnect between what students up to maybe the age of 16, 18 are sort of learning, and then what the universities are providing. Paul, I was wondering if maybe you would be able to just, from your experience, talk a little bit about the types of topics that are being taught, and whether or not there is in terms of climate change and sort of the ecological emergency, whether or not there is a link between, say, maths and physics and biology and geography, and whether you feel that there's enough sort of information coming back down from some of those higher education practitioners.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is in different countries, as long as the knowledge and the ideas and the skills are being conveyed, I guess maybe it doesn't matter so much if it's labelled as geography or not. So it seems like maybe there are subjects that pick this up as well. But yeah, in the UK, it's an interesting story. Lots of the curriculum that is taught is relatively dated. And the last time it was written, even the most recent, the sort of A-level, so this is sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds, the curriculum that they're exploring is about 5 or 6 years old. And so lots of, you know, the fast pace of a lot of the knowledge, and also the broader rhetoric around how we engage with this as a society has shifted quite quickly. And so the curriculum hasn't kept up with that. And there isn't really a mechanism for that to happen. And it does rely on teachers to very much pick it up and engage and embed it themselves. But what I'm also part of an organisation called Teachers for Climate Action. And we did some analysis of all of the GCSE and A-level specifications and explored which of them best addressed the climate and ecological emergency. So we looked at lots of the language that's used, partly also because these specifications that the exam boards provide are very much, you know, you could think of them almost as the Bible for these teachers. It's what directs what they're teaching, and it tells them what they should or shouldn't include. And so it's really important for them. They will look at the kind of language that's used, and it then impacts on the way that they teach and the emphasis that they give. And what we actually found is for both the climate and ecological emergency, it's biology that best addresses both in terms of the content, and geography is close behind. And geography definitely best addresses the climate change and concepts of climate change. But the reality is that it's very sparing across all subjects. The climate and ecological emergency is only included explicitly in biology, chemistry, and a little bit in physics and geography. And that's of all the subjects. Now, what we do find, though, is that there are lots and lots of organisations who are, I guess, making up the difference. And there are some superb resources and some great interactive maps and all kinds of graphs and data that teachers are using that have almost been designed for classrooms and are helping to disseminate the data and allow teachers to use this. So increasingly teachers are doing that. But one of the problems is, though, that there's a lack of explicit content around this in the current curriculum. And, you know, it's difficult to say who's to blame. There's not necessarily a mechanism to keep the curriculum updated. There's some interesting campaigns like Teach the Future, which are student-led, that are looking at actually challenging the government to better address this. And I guess one of the interesting questions as well is, should it be left to geography to be the only subject that actually really grapples with this, or does it need to be holistic across the whole curriculum? And maybe that's a broader question around the idea of how, as a society, do we need to respond to the climate and nature emergency?
Yeah, Keiko, you were nodding your head there at the mention of having a holistic sort of system set up. And we got any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with that. I think, like, maybe traditionally, as we put it in like climate science, it's like one genre, and then career within that will be like academic career. But I think climate change is clearly impacting us in so many levels. It's not just, you know, science where we need to understand how it's changing, but like what we do and how we do it is impacting the climate. So it's not just, for example, the energy sector. We do need to talk about climate, forestry, agriculture, and even retail when it comes to supply chain. So everything is basically, climate is relevant and impacting. So I do think that having geography as a subject is certainly important, but we do need to embed climate into the subject where there are, you know, it's relevant as well. So yeah, I think geography is, so I do feel both. I do want to keep geography, but I also think it should be holistic, so that it's not like, okay, today let's talk about geography and climate change, and then when we're talking about something else, we completely forget about climate.
Cool. Liza, I'd be really... Ruth.
Can I jump in just on
Yes,
that
go
thought?
for it.
And yeah, and I think it's so true with things like with maths and physics at school. You know, it's really hard to understand at that stage what those skills will be used for. And I'd never dreamt that my algebra would help me look at earthquakes and things like this. And often these kind of subjects that aren't necessarily everyone's favourite, but actually they're giving you a toolkit to address really exciting problems. And by combining that with your interest in geography and the earth, then you can do some really exciting things. But it's not always clear where a career in, you know, using maths and physics can get to. So yeah, the holistic approach is really important.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think one of the things that I wish I'd concentrated more on at school was maths, and in particular now, because so much of geography is handling data, that being able to understand the maths that goes into how you process that is really critical. Liza, I was interested in getting a US approach thought on some of the things we've been discussing, and whether or not at a sort of school and maybe university level, there is that sort of crossover in terms of the climate being discussed in different topics, if that's something you've come across.
Yeah, definitely. So I will say, you know, changing curriculum in the US is quite difficult, just because, you know, so much of the American education system is based solely off of, you know, national programs like the Advanced Placement Program or the IB program, for example. And so, you know, to a certain extent, it's not even, you know, states that are deciding what children learn. It's really just these national bodies that are. And so when I think about my time in school, you know, I took almost all of the classes in the advanced placement program, and I can remember almost none of them brought up climate change. And I think a lot of that is due to the political climate in the US. I think a lot of parents and students now, to a certain extent, would sharply rebel if, you know, for example, they don't believe in climate change, period, or they don't believe that it's caused by, you know, human drivers. And so, you know, there's been a lot of talk, especially recently in the US, in terms of, you know, indoctrination in US American education systems, not only on climate change, but also in different issues. And so I think it's become a very hot topic. And unfortunately, I think that's pushing people farther away instead of closer to tackling these more challenging, controversial issues, which is, you know, in my opinion, a shame. At the university level, obviously, there's a lot more integration of climate into curriculum depending on what you're studying. I'm personally, an Earth systems major, and so it's a very significant part of my classes across the board. However, I will say, that is largely constricted to Earth systems and the Department of Earth at Stanford. I'm taking this really fascinating international development course now, and you'd think it's an international development course, sustainable development would come up quite frequently, and thinking about the future, how climate change will start to impact development across the world, especially in the global south, you would think be a really big topic. But instead, I find that every class I'm kind of the person shouting, what about climate, and no one else really considers it to be the dramatic sort of changing factor that we're going to see in the field of international development. They're still kind of sticking to more traditional theories and ideologies. So I will say, definitely a mix. At the high school level, it's definitely hard in American systems. At the college level, there's more potential, but I would say we still have a really long way to go to that end.
Cool. Paul, yeah, you want to jump in?
I was going to jump in and just say that point about politicization of this is a really interesting one, because it's definitely where this sits, in the sense that there's so much public opinion around this that is then weighing in on what is taught, and it means that there's almost barriers to engaging with the reality of this and sort of exploring this in a genuine sense, because there's concern around the sort of politicization. But I think it's interesting, 99.9% of scientific evidence suggests that climate change is human induced. If anything, if you're not talking about this and not engaging in it, then that is indoctrination. To think about the politicization in that sense is interesting. I think so much of the challenges that we currently face are around the idea that we have a status quo, and we need to challenge that. And I think it's really important that we do that within education as well, rather than leaving education to the side and sort of think, okay, we can do this within society, but not within education.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I'm well aware that certainly, like, we're all sort of speaking in our own bubble, and most of the people we probably talk to are speaking in that as well, and we're all sort of coming at things from roughly the same perspective and hoping to get to roughly the same outcome. Just as you were mentioning that, Paul, I was thinking, I actually have no idea about what teenagers generally think in terms of climate. Like, everyone tells me on the news and in the media that they're engaged, but are you finding that there's a polarization between those who are engaged and those that aren't? Or is it just generally, as a cohort, the majority of them are engaged?
So in terms of, I think the reality for me is that there's a lot of apathy. Even when I'm teaching this sort of content, students who just shrug their shoulders, and it might be a reflection that we're not teaching it in the right way. We're not empowering and providing the agency. I think there's a vocal minority who are amplified and put on a pedestal, and I think that's an interesting thing to explore as well. The way that we look at youth activism and kind of how society engages with that. I think for many people, there's, just like in broader society with young people, there's this sense of actually, what can I do? And that's an important part of the jigsaw as well, is exploring the sort of the science and the understanding, but also looking then at the role that people play within this as well.
Okay, cool. Liza, go for it.
Yeah, so, I think I have a lot to say on this front, just because I'm surrounded by, teenagers every day. So I think from what I've seen, the problem with the student climate activism movement right now, is that it's unfortunately not very inclusive. And what I mean by that is that, students have essentially made it so that you're not sort of part or in the climate change movement unless you're kind of doing everything right. You take very short showers, you're vegan, you always carpool, just go through the gambit, the whole list of all these different climate mitigation actions. And that's absolutely not to say that, doing all of these things is bad in any respect. If it's reasonable for you to do them, then absolutely go for it. But the problem is that, unfortunately, many kids and teenagers are apathetic and they don't want to put in that extra effort. And so they think, I enjoy long showers, or I don't want to cut meat out of my diet. So therefore I am excluded from the environmental movement and no one is going to accept me there. And so they kind of sort themselves out. And I think that's a really big problem. And I think in my imagination, the perfect, youth-led climate change movement would be one where everyone is just kind of acknowledging that they're working towards the same goal here. We're all working towards the same goal of climate mitigation. It's just that everyone kind of goes about it in their own way. Maybe some people want to do the protest route. Maybe some people want to do the research route. Maybe some people want to support the movement, but in the end don't have the personal capacity to really put that much effort personally into it at all. And all of that is okay. And so I think, we could come really far in terms of encouraging students to get involved if we make it more acceptable to not be all in all the time, because I think ultimately that excludes more people than would be, ideal.
Yeah, no, definitely. Keiko, Ruth, is there anything you want to add to that before we move on from that topic? No? Okay. Oh, Keiko, then Paul.
Sure. I mean, there was just so many interesting topics came about, and yeah, I do. Well, first of all, I think the point Paul mentioned about, are we doing a good job making people feel empowered, motivated to do something about climate change? And that's something I actually cared when I designed my PhD research. I worked on palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia. And what we all hear about palm oil is how much forest we are losing every day, like one football field, every second, every minute, and every hour. And it is an important thing to know and be aware. But what it's doing is, we feel angry, sad, but then what can we do about it? There are so many things you could do, but there's no magic bullet to solve the situation either. So what I wanted to do was, instead of understanding how much we are losing, how much we still have left, but how much we could lose to palm oil plantations. So that's a little bit more concrete action. We still have this much forest left in the palm oil concession area. That was specifically my PhD research. So it's a forest in death row. It can be legally cleared today, tomorrow, or a year later, or 10 years. We don't know. If we don't do anything about it, then we will lose it. But if we do something today, we can still keep it. That's all up to us. And that I felt a little, better. And we feel a little bit clearer in terms of, okay, what we need to watch out, what we can do. So yeah, that's one thing I wanted to mention.
Cool. And Paul, you wanted to jump in as well.
One in the bit that conversation was leading me to think as well is the power of geography, the potential that geography has is to expose a lot of these societal structures. And actually that maybe is where the discussion needs to lie, is kind of using geography as a way to expose those and explore them, and then ask questions about how we should be structuring society, and actually engaging young people in those conversations to move beyond the idea that you either behave in this way or you have to do this thing or not do this thing, is actually how we can affect change.
Yeah, no, definitely. Okay, I'm going to move on slightly. It's sort of related, but I was just going to ask you, Ruth, whether or not you think that there's a sort of reasonably well-defined path into careers around climate science, or whether you think that everybody makes up their own path as it is, and sort of ends up where they end up. But I was just thinking, from your experience with sort of students wanting to do PhDs, are they all more or less coming at it from the same sorts of areas and wanting to make the same sorts of impacts when we're talking about climate change, that is?
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways that you can come at it. And I think that some people chose their PhD because they knew they wanted to do research. They knew they wanted to find out something new and to keep doing science. And then they looked at what was available and they thought, actually, why not choose one that's on climate change? It's really important, and this is important to me. And so I might be coming at it from a research, I want to do research angle, and then choosing accordingly. And other people have come at it from, I care deeply about ecology, and I know that ecology is what I want to do, and maybe that's in industry or maybe that's in academia, but actually here's this PhD that will teach me a brand new set of schools. And so I think there's lots of different ways. And I think as well, a really key part of this is not just doing the science, but also communicating the science, because it's a great, interesting point that you made, Paul, about the curriculum being outdated. And the thing is that, there's so much research being done, but actually the kind of talks that you hear in university, it's not in any book. It might not be written down yet. The figures you're seeing in a presentation might not have made it onto a page to publish a paper to eventually go into a book to get passed on to the curriculum. So actually it's even if you're in, not necessarily like nitty gritty doing the coding science, but actually people communicating the science is as valuable as the rest of it, because if we're doing this and keeping it to ourselves, then what's the good in that? So, and then there's a whole social aspects of how do we go out and tell people, and how do we as people influence policymakers? And so there's a whole jumble of things there, and depending on what your interests are and what you enjoy doing, I think there's loads of different ways that you can come at it. And maybe that's through research, but maybe that's through working more with people, and there's lots of different things.
Yeah, no, definitely. Keiko, I know that you have opinions on moving from academia into industry, and I'd be quite interested to hear your sort of thoughts around the difference between the two areas.
Yeah, it's pretty much related to what Ruth said also. In terms of my own transition, it was rather smooth at first, because I moved from PhD to a startup company, which was established by my supervisor. So in terms of my personal environment, it was a smoother transition. However, the more I interacted with people outside of academia, and also people from businesses and other sectors where they don't use remote sensing, the more I realized that I need to change the way I communicate science. Like, no one really has a patience to talk about uncertainty from like RMSE point of view. I mean, can you tell us, what do you mean exactly? Is this correct or not correct? And although people don't like complicated statistics, I think people actually love descriptive statistics. 90% of the time, this will be correct. People like that kind of simple way of putting it. So in order to do that, actually, scientists need to think a little bit in a different way, really need to understand the application and what these users care most about, and if the model is really responding to that, and whatever error and uncertainty is outside of what they care most. So we also need to change the way we do science, but also how we communicate science. This is something I'm learning still every day.
That's great. Yeah, that's a great point, that we are all learning every day still, all of these things. Liza, I was just wondering whether or not you had any thoughts around the communication aspects that have been mentioned by Ruth and Keiko, or whether you've got anything you want to say around some of the tooling that's being used, things like Google Earth Engine and other things like that, which are really transforming the way in which students are able to start doing some pretty hefty science relatively early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've come a really long way as a scientific community in terms of recognizing that our results and our papers should not just stay in the hands of journals and of other scientists. I think tools like Google Earth Engine and Google Earth in particular have really, transformed our ability to take that science and directly put it in the hands of students around the world. As for me, I started working in Earth Engine, just out of middle school. And if anything, that just proves that any kid can do that. I didn't come in with really any coding experience. You don't need to have a PhD to be able to use Google Earth Engine. And so I think I'm really personally excited about, I think, the momentum surrounding the scientific community in terms of, being excited about finding new ways to communicate their research, going beyond just the realm of statistics when we're thinking of how we can just, best adapt our results to a public understanding and a public level of knowledge. And I think, maybe Google Earth Engine isn't sort of the answer to all of this. I think, different kids are going to be best suited towards understanding different scientific trends in different ways. Maybe some kids will do best with a modeling route and the coding route and the remote sensing route. Maybe some kids will do better on, the newscasting route and looking at just news articles and reading reports, things like that. I think what we have to realize is that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution here, and looking for sort of a silver bullet to climate communication is a really false narrative, and it's one that we should try and dispel, as scientists and as people who are looking to find that answer here. There really isn't one. It's just how can we sort of combine all of these different techniques, quantitative, qualitative, visual, all of these, to make sure that any audience that we're facing has the opportunity to take in this information in a way that's really conducive to their personal understanding.
Cool. Paul, I was just wondering actually whether you could build on something that Eliza said there about the qualitative and the quantitative, and how that's being taught at a sort of school level.
I first of all just wanted to throw in a bit some of my reflections of that as well. Conversation. I think coronavirus has just shown how poor the general public's science literacy is, and understanding in a concept like uncertainty, that we've got so much work to do just to build people's understanding of general science and how science works, if anything. This phrase of following the science and all those sorts of things, I think really have highlighted that. The other one I wanted to say is there's an organisation called Climate Outreach in the UK who've been doing really well in terms of researching the way that we communicate the message around climate change, and also then adapting it for different audiences. And so understanding that some people are receptive to a message communicated in a certain way, whilst others need it communicated completely differently, but it's behind it is the same sort of scientific message. I think that's really interesting. The other one was Ed Hawkins. His warming stripes have done so much, I think, in terms of science communication and climate change communication, just really stripping back the way that you share information. And I know that lots of schools are using his graphics and just the warming stripes website in order to explore the climate change around the world. And I know that there are far more complex websites that show that same sort of information in much more detail and related. I do think one thing that is good, particularly at the 16 to 18 age range, is the research that students carry out themselves. So at geography, students have to carry out an independent investigation, and it's something that's gone a bit full circle. It's something I think that was previously in the A level and maybe disappeared and has come back over the last few years. And actually that means students can really do their own research through primary and secondary data and statistical analysis, and that plays quite a key role now. So statistics is a really important part of the geography A level, and it gets students to get to grips with those sorts of qualitative and quantitative data in that sense. And again, there's some really useful resources through some of the big organizations that help teachers to kind of communicate that and for students to carry that out. So that's definitely one of the strengths, I think, of geography at the moment at the school level, is that emphasis on field work and statistical testing. Okay,
cool. So I was wondering if I was, say, in that 16 to 18 year old range, and I was interested in sort of issues around climate change and geography, what sorts of things can I do, maybe outside of the curriculum, that will make sure that I'm educating myself around that? Sorry, that's Paul.
Outside of the curriculum. So
yeah, just like, is there a wider sort of gamut of resources that are really useful to people who are looking to maybe go on to do a degree in this type of thing?
The ones that come to mind are, there's some really interesting video content. I think it's called Water Bear. There's some online platforms where there's some really interesting video content that's available for people to explore. something else I'm involved with is an organization called Aim High, and we've developed a sort of interactive online climate and nature course, and we've had it's sort of thing that's perfect for young people as well. That's what's interesting about this as well, is that it's always happened throughout history that if you are really interested at school about something, you'll find a book or a website, or you'll find content to explore that in more detail. And I think a very generic thing to say, but the internet has enabled that to happen and multiply, that I think young people, so quickly now for them to find that sort of information and to engage with that, but also I guess to build communities and to engage with other like-minded young people. And so there's so many youth groups as well now, and lots of this now is quite regionally based, so connecting with young people within your local area and exploring this. I guess it doesn't have to be the activist route as well. I think there are young people who are really working proactively to I guess change within their school community or within their local community and have that kind of positive impact as well, and share the information with other people.
Cool. Ruth, go for it.
Yeah, just to jump in on the other avenues to find out about this. I think that so you mentioned the brilliant Show Your Stripes, so moving from blue to red. I came across this on Twitter, so maybe Twitter is kind of an old person platform, and actually we should all be on TikTok. But my Twitter is basically equal part science and baking, because I follow people who do interesting science and who bake interesting things. So this is a great way, if you're interested in climate change and you want to find out the cutting edge science, find scientists on social media, and they'll tweet about their work and what they found, and not just the nitty gritty science, please read my paper, but also interesting visuals and new ways to think about things and new ways to communicate it. So I find that really interesting. And things like, wealth of satellite data, if there's, the volcanic eruption in La Palma, follow the scientists who are on the ground and who are doing the satellite processing. And that's a really good way to get really current science that isn't peer reviewed. It's not taken ages to be written in a book. It's happening right now, and someone's just, taken a print screen and put it on the internet. So that's a really good route.
Cool. Yeah, and unlike most of Twitter, it seems like geography and sort of Earth observation, everyone's really nice, which always makes a good thing. Liza, I was just going to come to you, and I realize that NASA has a massive amount of data and resources for all of this type of thing. But given your experience, I was just wondering whether or not there are any specific things that you might want to point people at. I mean, it doesn't have to be NASA, but I was just thinking of what you were saying earlier about your background. That you found particularly useful, or you think others might find useful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm a really big proponent of NASA's GLOBE program. It's a program that's built for, an educational purpose for students, I think up to, the end of high school. And what GLOBE seeks to do is involve students and make them become essentially citizen scientists, so that they're able to collect environmental data on their own and then actually submit it to kind of a global repository that actual NASA scientists are then able to use to inform their own work and do things like accuracy assessment. And I think what the GLOBE program has been able to successfully do is enable students to feel like they too have kind of a place in environmental science, and collecting data and starting these sorts of environmental experiments are not sort of as foreign as they might think. And so I think definitely students should check out the GLOBE program. I think NASA internships, I'm obviously a really big proponent of as well. They technically start officially at age 16. But I think, I've yet to meet another student at NASA who has been part of the internship program who has had even a mediocre experience. I think, NASA scientists do a really good job and put a lot of effort into making sure that students feel included and they feel like they, have a stake in the research that they do on their own, in addition to that of their mentor. So I think, not just at NASA, but across other environmental agencies in the US and abroad, I think it's really important for students, if they're interested in getting involved in the environmental space, for them to try it. And, worst comes to worst, maybe they don't enjoy environmental research and feel like going into the corporate space, for example, would be more effective, or, going into other aspects of government. But the important thing is that they just kind of put themselves out there. So I think, I would say definitely check out a lot of NASA's online resources like GLOBE, but the best part, and I think the most effective part of getting involved in NASA's work is just simply trying to get there yourself and experiencing it on your own.
No, brilliant. Yeah. So I've got I'm conscious of time, and I've got one final question, and hopefully it'll be an interesting question. So the person who got me into everything to do with geography and climate and environmental stuff was my geography teacher. I mean, my geography teacher was amazing. He basically started teaching the same day that I started secondary school, and I had him teaching me geography for every single year group that I went through, and it was brilliant because every time I got excited by something, he would sort of run off and go and get excited by it and find loads of resources and then teach on that, and then that would get another idea going in someone else's head, and he'd run off and go and get. And I have no idea what the actual curriculum was supposed to be, but I'm guessing he must have broken it multiple times over. And then since then, I had, again, really inspiring people. I was really lucky to have inspiring people at both degree level and postdoc level as well, sort of helping me out. So my question generally to all of you is, who or what has inspired you to work in the area of geography or geospatial, or indeed sort of the climate change area that we're looking at the moment? And I realize that's a really hard one, puts you all on the spot. So actually, Liza, if I could come to you first.
Yes, definitely. This is definitely an easy question for me because there's so many people in my life who have made such a dramatic impact in terms of my love of environmental science. But I would say my two primary mentors at NASA, David Lagomasino and Lola Fatoyenvo, are just incredible. I came into NASA really not even knowing what a satellite was and not knowing what a mangrove forest was. I was truly starting at ground zero. But what my two mentors really showed me was that, that doesn't matter. All you truly need here is just a willingness to learn and an excitement for doing what, you just think is the natural path through this field, not what anyone else thinks. And I think most importantly, they treated me like an adult. They treated me not like the 14-year-old, kid that I was. And I think that's so important for me that was so important for me and still is in terms of realizing the validity of my work in environmental science and outside of it, and realizing that I too have something to contribute to the conversation. And I think gaining that confidence from them, in addition to all of the environmental science knowledge, was really critical towards encouraging me to continue down the road of this field. And I honestly think, without solid mentors in your life, it becomes very, very difficult to keep going through topics that you're not familiar with or that you're not confident in. And so I'm so lucky that both David and Lolo have been there continuously and continue to be in sort of guiding me through that path.
No, that's great. Yeah, it's always brilliant when you've got someone you can rely on like that. Ruth, what about you?
Yeah, I think what I want to say is I had some great mentors and teachers, one much like yours, Alistair, Mr. Gibbs, if he's listening, and my mum is probably why I did geology. If she's listening, she'll love that. But I think what I want to say as well is, for me, it was kind of equal part luck. So I didn't think as a person at school, when I'm this age, I want to be doing this and I want to be studying this. I did what I enjoyed, and I took decisions that have taken me on a windy road to sit here. And I think that's really important too, because I think when you're at school, it can be quite intimidating, and people saying, "Oh, you've got so many options. What are you going to do?" And absolutely, if you're passionate about climate, keep things on the horizon and thinking, is that helping me get to what I want to do? But equally, do what you enjoy, and great opportunities will pop up, and take advantage of them. So don't feel that you have to get steered in this way. We're all making it up as we go along and doing interesting things along the way.
Definitely making it up as we go along. Yeah. Keiko, next to you.
There are just too many people. I mean, technically speaking, of course, my supervisors, Professor Edward Mitchell and Dr. Genevieve Paternotte from Edinburgh, they helped me to acquire knowledge and skill that I'm using today. But also when I was doing my field work in Myanmar, these people that I met on the field, just because I'm a student and I want to learn, people went above and beyond, helped me get the data and information I wanted. And they really do, inspire me and help my research as well. And also perhaps like Ruth mentioned her mother, and I also like to mention my mother in a slightly different way, going back to the point Liza mentioned earlier about climate movement not being inclusive. I grew up in a single parent household, and my mother was the breadwinner of the family. And looking back, choices she has made, I mean, there was absolutely no room in her space and mind to think about environmental impact of the choices she was making. And I just want, when we teach people or raise awareness, we also want to be aware that we are making choices among the choices that are given to us, and those choices often do not include environmental costs also. And those like social and, economic differences in background are another reason that's just not a fair ground. And we really need to be aware of that and not blaming people we don't want to blame. And, we are all in this together. So I just wanted to mention about that.
No, that's a really, really good point to have made. No, thank you for that. And Paul, to you.
I guess so much of my motivation comes from a sense that there's injustice, so that something's wrong, and kind of witnessing that, be it in education, thinking this isn't the right thing they should be taught, or, more broadly in the world, seeing damage and destruction to people or the planet, and just thinking that there needs to be something done differently. That's a lot of my motivation comes from that. And then I think also there's a sort of reciprocal relationship from then, seeing, for me, with young people, how they then respond and react to that, and how you can see how their understanding evolves and develops. And I think I'm essentially, my tool or skill, I think, is through education, is hoping then to make a sort of better world through that lens, just in the sense of getting young people to engage more critically with the world around them. And, like everyone has said, there are people along that journey who've helped inspire and encourage me. And also so much of that as well has come from just being in the world. And I think earlier people were talking about experiences they had in places, witnessing something or just feeling a connection and a relationship to the rest of nature. And I think that we can't underestimate that as well. And I think geography, but also education more broadly, has the ability to create those situations and to embed those sort of experiences and circumstances. I think that's so important as well.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for your inputs to this. This has been a really fascinating hour. It's been brilliant talking to you all and finding your thoughts and opinions on various different things. I think we're all agreed that geography is amazing and excellent. Geospatial go as well for the data sets and things like that. And that we really can make a difference if we're applying those to the problems of climate change. So thank you again
so much.